The story of the Star of Bethlehem has vaguely bothered me ever since I was a kid. It's a weird story with some bits that just never made sense to me. Why did a star lead them to Jerusalem and not Bethlehem? For that matter, how does a star say that a king has been born at all? And if the star was so obvious, why didn't Herod and his advisors, or for that matter, anyone else, notice it? Then I heard the story of how an ancient coin led an astronomer to a theory on the Star of Bethlehem that completely blew my mind. And it's by far the most compelling explanation I've ever heard. Michael Molnar was a professional astronomer when he came across an ancient coin. Two things caught his attention. First, the coin was minted by Quirinius, who, according to the Gospel of Luke, was governor of Judea at the time of Jesus' birth. And second, the coin featured a ram looking over its shoulder at a very prominent star. Could that star be the same one we know today as the Star of Bethlehem? As an astronomer, Molnar was well situated to start pulling that thread. The first thing he set out to learn is what the ram was doing on a coin with the star. And what he learned was fascinating. The ram was Aries, one of the 12 Zodiac symbols, and in Roman astrology, each part of the world was represented by a different sign. So if you saw something portentous in the sky, you would know where in the world it was going to happen based on which part of the sky it was happening in. Most of the time, Aries represented the region of Syria, including Antioch, where the coin was minted, Jerusalem, where the wise men arrived, and of course, little old Bethlehem. Disclaimer, I do not believe in astrology or horoscopes. Before I started reading Molnar's book, I couldn't even have told you how many zodiac signs there are. I still couldn't name them all for you. Though I did look up my own star chart out of curiosity and found out that I rate a 0 out of 5 for capable. So there's that. But this isn't about what I believe, it's about what an ancient astrologer would have believed about what they were seeing in the sky. So Aries representing Judea explains how something portentous in the sky could point a group of magi astrologers to Judea, but not Bethlehem specifically. I would have been pretty interested if the discovery stopped there, but they didn't. Historically, people looking for an explanation of the Star of Bethlehem have tended to look for things that we find unusual happening in the sky around the time of Jesus' birth, and then saying this was probably it. Things like comets and super bright stars. But often they don't actually look at how ancient people interpreted those things. For example, even if there were a comet right around the time of Jesus' birth, ancient people would have interpreted that as an evil omen. Molnar took the opposite approach. Since Aries was an astrological symbol and magi were astrologers, he went looking for what astrologers from the time would have understood as a sign that an important king had been born. Fortunately, he didn't need to guess because there are a lot of surviving writings from the ancient Roman world about how to properly interpret the stars, and in his book, Molnar quotes them extensively. So what star would ancient astrologers interpret as a sign that an important king had been born? It's important to note that the Greek word for star, aster, could refer to any object in the night sky. The moon, sun, and planets were known as wandering stars because they moved somewhat independently from the rest of the night sky. The English word planet actually comes from the Greek word to wander. And as an aside, I love history, theology, psychology, sociology, and the cross-section between them all. Learning more is how I try to love God with all my mind, and this channel is where I share things that I found interesting or that I wish I had known sooner. If that's something that you're interested in, please consider liking, subscribing, and chiming in the comments below. Anyhow, ancient astrologers looked at a lot of different things. Different planets had different meanings. Their effects could be amplified if they were in the right zodiac sign. There were combinations of planets and signs that were important when together. The order in which planets rose mattered. But most of those included multiple planets or might point to important events, but not necessarily to the birth of a king. Matthew's account mentions one star specifically, and the wise men show up looking for a newborn king. That made Saturn and Jupiter the most likely options if Matthew was reliable and if Molnar was on the right track. Saturn and Jupiter were god kings in the Roman pantheon, so they represented royalty in the sky. Jupiter was the more important of the two because Jupiter was the king of the gods. So Molnar was looking at things happening in Aries because Aries represented Judea, and he felt confident that if it was one star, it would be something related to Jupiter. But Jupiter just being in Aries wasn't notable, so what could have happened with Jupiter that was unique enough to send some wise men road tripping? Jupiter passing behind the sun and rising as a morning star was notable astrologically. It happened about once a year, which made it unusual, but probably not anything to start saddling up your camel over. Jupiter passing behind the moon, on the other hand, was in a different league entirely. Passing behind the moon is known as a lunar occultation in astronomy. You can basically think of it like the moon eclipsing a planet. To give you an idea of how frequently that happens, the last eclipse of Jupiter visible from North America was in 2004. The one before that, 1968, almost 40 years prior. In my very limited time learning about ancient astrology, seems like the rarer the thing, the bigger the deal, and that fits the bill here. This would have been a very big deal, supercharging the kinginess of Jupiter. One astrologer said, babies born when the moon and Jupiter are close are, quote, deemed worthy of gifts or honors, which Molnar points out seems significant given the prominence of gifts in Matthew's account. And note that that's even when the moon and Jupiter are close. The moon eclipsing Jupiter would be next level. So Molnar went looking for a date around the time of Jesus' birth where the moon eclipsed Jupiter. As a very brief aside, in case you aren't aware, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th, year 0. The BC AD year calculation didn't happen until the 6th century, and the math wasn't perfect. But by looking at the events in the New Testament accounts, for example, when Herod the Great lived and died, we can get a pretty clear range of possible dates. How Christmas ended up on December 25th is a story for another time. If you're interested, subscribe, and I'm sure we'll get there eventually. Anyhow, Molnar went looking for a time that the moon eclipsed Jupiter in Aries in the date range, and lo and behold, April 17th, 6 BC was just that. And there was something especially notable about that day. Do you remember how Matthew says that the wise men saw the star in the east? He actually mentions it twice. Well, as it turns out, in the east, or at its rising, as the NIV translates it, was an astrological term for a planet rising as a morning star just before the sun. And on that day, when the moon eclipsed Jupiter, April 17th, 6 BC, that's exactly what Jupiter did, just like Matthew described. Not only is that a striking connection to Matthew's account, that made this an even more momentous day from an astrologer's perspective. Like we talked about, passing behind the sun was a big deal. Being close to the moon was a huge deal, but it was the biggest of deals to be close to both the sun and the moon. The astrologer Antigonus said the reason Hadrian became emperor was because Jupiter and the moon were close together on the day he was born, and it was near the time that Jupiter rose in the east. And again, that's just the moon and Jupiter being close. And that's not all. The rest of the night sky was in a configuration that day that would have been striking even without the eclipse of Jupiter. Long story short, between the eclipse of Jupiter, its rising just before the sun, and the positions of the other planets, the historian Chris Forbes says that this is a configuration that happens once every 3,000 years. That certainly seems like a plausible reason for some star-watching magi to take a trip west to the land of Aries to meet this new king who is going to be such a big deal. And also, like a big enough deal, that a coin might be minted to commemorate the day Jupiter was eclipsed by the moon in Aries, though certainly not knowingly in honor of the then teenage Jesus. Importantly, it's impossible to prove that April 17th, 6 BC was the day Jesus was born. But we do know for sure that this exact combination of things happened that day because we have computer models that can wind back the time. This is a picture of an independent verification I found online that someone else ran to confirm it. And it seems like we can be reasonably confident that this is the way that at least some ancient astrologers would have interpreted things because we have many of their writings, which makes this by far the most compelling explanation I've ever heard for dealing with the things about the Star of Bethlehem that have always bothered me. The connection between Aries and Judea explains how a star could lead to the region, but not Bethlehem specifically. And if you're looking for a newborn king, it makes sense to go to where the existing king, Herod, was, which was in Jerusalem. Jupiter was the wandering star that represented kings, and being eclipsed by the moon was something that was rare and momentous according to the ways ancient astrologers read the stars. Not only that, but what the rest of the planets were doing that day would have made this day a big deal all on its own. And Matthew's description of the star being in the east as a morning star perfectly lines up with this day. And the fact that this was astrology and not something like a super bright star or a comet explains why Herod and the other people in Judea wouldn't have noticed anything noteworthy. Jews didn't practice astrology. God condemned it. And that is something I have loved about this story for years. I don't believe in astrology. God tells us not to look to the stars for answers. And yet, he knew that that's where many people were looking for answers. And so on this occasion, God met them where they were at, to call them literally, physically to himself. Speaking of things I love, what we talked about here isn't even my favorite part about all of this. What most blew my mind took a bit more astrological explanation than I figured the average viewer would be interested in. But if you want to know more, I highly recommend taking a look. You can check it out in the link here or in the description below. As much as I love the idea of this, I hold it loosely. In his commentary on Genesis, Augustine advises that we hold loosely onto non-essential beliefs so that if they fall, we don't fall with them, and that's definitely what I'm doing here. You can check out Molnar's book yourself. It's not big, but it's not exactly a page turner either, with all of the arcane charts and ancient quotes. But there's more in it than I have covered here, including how went before and stopped over, other ways that Matthew describes the star's actions, are also phrases with astronomical meanings. I'd love to hear your thoughts. How does this strike you? Go tell me how ridiculous this is in the comments below, or share some encouraging words. I'm told that's allowed too. And Merry Christmas, and praise be to the God who meets us where we are at.